So the original title of this talk was How to Teach an Old Dog New Tricks, Modernizing a Business with Data Products, but perhaps a more descriptive title about what I want to talk about is Adapting to the Evolving Nature of Data Products Through Governance. And so, like any good data scientist, I want to give you some context about what I'm talking about. So we'll talk a little bit about the what, why, and how of data governance for folks like yourselves, data practitioners. And so we'll give some context around the landscape around data products and data science, some of the consumer and regulatory concerns that are cropping up about data, and then finally go through a case study, like a real-world case study of something that we went through at Mozilla, where I currently work. Cool. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge my team. So the Mozilla revenue data team has done like a ton of work, and I would not be able to give the talk in the way that I can give it today without their hard work, specifically Shen Liu and Arkadiusz Komarzuski. So like Sean said, I'm a senior data science and machine learning manager at Mozilla, where I've worked on everything from metrics, revenue, machine learning and data products, and subscription services. And then in a past life, I worked at Twitter on internet health and safety, and also I've worked in ad tech in a past life. And then I guess my last background is I would be remiss to say if I didn't say that we are hiring. So if you're interested in anything I have to say, you can go to careers.mozilla.org. Cool. So over the past several years, and even more than that, we've really started talking about this notion of data and data products, right? So in DJ Patil's Data Jiu-Jitsu, he says that a data product is one that facilitates an end goal through the use of data, which is like kind of like a broad definition, but it does give framing. It makes this like a legitimate thing. Like a data product is like an actual thing, not just like some sort of like notional like concept or philosophical idea. And then more recently in the data mesh paper, there's this notion of data as a product. And so it's this idea that like applying data thinking by the data team to this thing that you're building, right? And you have to think about like this thing that you're building where you have stakeholders and customers. And these customers are data scientists, ML and data engineers, and other data practitioners who are going to be using this like thing that you've built. And I think the reason why this is like really important to point out is that we're at the point now where before having data products or thinking like data as a product was a comparative advantage. But we're not there anymore, right? We've evolved beyond that as an industry, and data is not just like an advantage, it's like table stakes to be competitive. So where do we see this in the wild? So I have like 4 different examples. So the first one is Google Maps, and it is taking us from where we are, the AT&T Conference Center, to Interstellar Barbecue, the #2 barbecue spot in Texas Monthly in 2021. And it uses data, right? It looks at traffic data at, well, like I guess the time I took the screenshot, which was late at night. I bet it takes longer to get there. And it gives you, the end user, some options and like routes you might want to take, right? The next screenshot is of Etsy. So a couple months ago, it was Lunar New Year, and I was looking at hanbok, which are like traditional Korean clothing. I didn't buy any of them because they're expensive. But Etsy sure remembered that I looked at them, and they're offering me the opportunity to potentially like get back into that search I was doing to maybe buy some more. The next one is a screenshot from Airbnb. So Port Aransas is a beautiful like coastal town on the Gulf Coast of Texas. It's a place that I've been to using Airbnb before, and so they remember, right? And Wimberley is like a tiny town in the hill country, and if you're visiting, it's a great place if you want to go for an excursion while you're here. And they're using things like my geolocation and my past history to like offer, again, inspiration for my trip, as they like to call it. The last example is like a different kind of data product, and this is the Firefox public data report. And this is offering data products as like metrics. And so like it's a set of like different data visualizations and like pieces of information. The screenshot that I have here is the top languages of Firefox desktop users. And what I think is like interesting about this is like when people think about data products, they're usually thinking about like recommender systems or like other kind of really interesting machine learning or AI applications. But like analytics is a very valid and important data product. So I've given like talks like this before where I talk about kind of like data science at a high level, and I think the thing that you can say about all data products is the underlying thing that ties them is not just data, but data that has been scienced in some particular way. But then this gets to the kind of question of what is data science, right? And so you have different like infographics and like really beautiful Venn diagrams. Like one of my favorite representations of this is a billboard in my daughter's kindergarten class, which is like, what do scientists do? And it had some like pretty like big questions, but it was like kind of the broadest like generalization I could find that like sort of fit what I felt like my day job was. Secretly, my favorite one is actually this, where they add the low for evil. In defense of my grad school office mate, he's not evil. And also a data scientist. But like, if we want to go beyond the Venn diagram and like kind of get like a little bit more precise, like what is data science? So at the end of last year, Emily Charillo gave this really provocative talk that was titled Down with Data Science. And I'm not here to defend or refute any of her claims, but one of the things I think she did that was really interesting and actually kind of important was break out the different kind of functions that like fall under this like title data science, because it's a pretty big term. And so you have data engineers, analytics engineers, data analysts, and machine learning engineers. And I think the thing that like needs sometimes more love, but maybe not to this crowd, is data analysts or data analytics. So to like show a little love to analytics, like what is it? It's insight as output, or you can think about insight as the product that you're creating as a data practitioner, right? It's very powerful because you use like analytics to play the objective voice of your customers or your users or whatever you're trying to like characterize with analytics. And so you have like these metrics or measurements that you're creating, and your company uses them, right, to understand how they're doing, to like view its health, right? So we're talking about how like data is no longer a comparative advantage, it's like critical. And having analytics around like the success of your company is really important to know how you're doing. This can look like a variety of different things. It could be opportunity sizing or like prototyping like new ideas. It could be like causal inference, experimentation stuff. It could be impact analyses for whenever like you can't do an experiment for whatever reason, right? But what is the secret to all of these, right? It's data. Data underlies like analytics and like all of these data products, not even just like in the analytics case. But the thing that's happening at the same time is that consumers and users are really starting to pay attention to what companies are doing with their data, right? So like a few years ago, Equifax, which does like credit scores, and you can compute credit scores with a lot of really personal and sensitive information, right? They had a data breach, and it was like horrible because it was potentially like 143 million people just in the US alone, which is a lot of people, right? Facebook has obviously gone through issues with Cambridge Analytica and like how data are being used in like consent flows, right? And then you even have like notions around like terms, right? New terms like surveillance capitalism, right? So people every day who are like having their data like leveraged by different companies for like profit are really starting to question like, should these companies have my data and like what are they doing with it? At the same time, regulators are starting to take notice too. And so like before I get into this slide, I should say, though I contain multitudes, one of them is not lawyer. So if you have more GDPR questions, please find your local friendly JD. So we all like probably have heard of GDPR, right? The General Data Privacy Regulation. It's part of like the EU's privacy and human rights laws. And it dictates like kind of and sets standards for how companies can do stuff with your data if you are an EU citizen. And so for users, it means that they can know how their data is used, what data companies have about them, they can correct mistakes in their data, and importantly, they can opt out, right? So there's like consent that is like a really important part of this, right? What makes this actually like enforceable? Like why do companies have to pay attention to it? There's like huge fines that are involved with like violating GDPR. And so maybe one strategy if you're a company could be, well, I'm going to ignore the GDPR by like not serving any customers in Europe. But the problem with that is that this is like the first of many. And so even in the US, like there's things like the California Consumer Privacy Act or CCPA that like is in some ways even more restrictive than GDPR, and like other even states within the US are coming up with more of these kinds of regulatory measures in other regions and countries too. Okay, so we have this big tension, right, between like companies need data to compete, right? But users and regulators are like, hey, like, why don't you slow your roll and like think about this like a little more? So how do you overcome the tension? And if you take away anything from this talk, it's that I like strongly believe that data governance is data strategy. And so what is data governance? It's the set of roles, policies, processes, and technologies that help an organization like handle its data, like in ways that are like consistent and appropriate and in compliance. And why is it important as opposed to like, because like, I just said it's like strategy, right? But it's important because it makes sure that you're complying with all of these like different regulatory like bodies. It makes sure that like your data are secure, that you're thinking about data privacy, and not even just data privacy, but also the quality of the data that you're putting out there and using and trying to make decisions with. It talks about things like availability, right? Like if your data are all over the place, like how does SRE help you when everything falls over? They probably can't. And importantly, it's usability. So it's like one of the worst situations to be in is to collect like piles and piles of data that you can't do anything with, right? And so you need to make sure that the data are usable. And at the end of the day, I think it provides like the foundation for a company's ability to be successful in its data strategy. So I want to go over a case study that we have encountered or really gone through, lived through at Mozilla. So this is something that we've called the Revenue Data Access Initiative. And in some ways, it seems maybe a little bit different than what I was talking about because like that was like about, I've been talking about data privacy and whatnot. But the thing about revenue data is that it's sensitive. And that's the thing that it has in common with like data privacy, is that like you have to be careful in how you handle the data and very thoughtful, right? And so we have this problem statement of like how do we leverage sensitive data for insight and understanding. And so let's get into how we thought about this and how we approached this issue. Because what we really wanted to do is take all of this information about revenue that we had at the company that was very sensitive and really think about it as a data product. So I think one of the most important aspects of this whole entire like project has been this notion of threat modeling. So what is it? Threat modeling is this technique that we often encounter in like security, where you identify vulnerabilities in the thing that you're building while defining solutions to mitigate the risks, right? And so what does this mean for revenue data? So revenue data, like what are we building? We're really trying to build this like revenue analytics data product. Why? Because like revenue data are really important. Like they allow us to make better choices about our business. But like what risk do these bring, right? They're really sensitive because a lot of Mozilla's revenue comes through partnerships with like external companies. And so we have a responsibility to these companies to keep confidential information confidential, right? Again, I want to point out that it doesn't contain personal information, but it's still like it's sensitive. And then what are the things we think we can do to like mitigate those risks? Well, we need a system that's designed to do the following. One is only give access to the people who really need access to the data. And once you do have access, it needs to be easy to use, right? So it needs to be easy to process, to evaluate, or to make decisions from. And again, it's like we want to make sure that like the data are in the hands only of the people who really need it due to like the sensitive nature and like the responsibilities we have to our partners. So I think that Monica Rogatti's very famous hierarchy of needs is like kind of like a nice place to like think about this space. So like it illustrates very cleanly why you can't go from like 0 to GANs in the blink of an eye, but I think it's also a helpful framework for data products. So where are we a couple years ago? So we were really far down on this triangle, like towards the bottom. It's like we had data, they were kind of all over the place. We had some infrastructure, some of it lived in like real places where you'd want it to live, like a BigQuery type situation, and some of it absolutely did not. And so what we really needed to do with this initiative was move up this triangle. So what was the state of our revenue data? So we had PDFs, we had spreadsheets, and we had APIs in like the best case. And it was like really exciting when we had APIs. Sometimes these PDFs were like hand curated from non-Mozillians, people who didn't work at the company, and they were maintained by non-technologists. So like they're finance people, like people who like really needed to have that information, but because of the sensitivity of it, right, like it wasn't given like broadly, it was given like to like this kind of tiny group of people. Sometimes the data lived in emails, and if we were lucky, sometimes they lived in Box, which is like a storage solution, right? Again, they're very sensitive data, which is like why they lived in all these kind of disparate places. And where we had it kind of made it such that you had all or nothing access. And that could have been okay, except once you did have access to everything, it was still incredibly challenging to use. It wasn't hooked up to like our data warehouse where like the rest of the data scientists and data engineers tend to like work in. And it was something that like, it was just like very hard to make any insights or get like a lot of good information off of it because of like where it lived. And finally, like this is like 2 CFOs ago, it was safeguarded by the CFO herself. I was thinking about putting a screenshot I have of an email I have from her that said that I personally had the authority to make decisions about who got access to this data set. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I decided to not include that. But that's not scalable, right? I'm like, and so we needed to figure out something to address this. And so really, again, at the heart of this was we needed to start thinking about revenue data as a product. So we have a revenue data science team at Mozilla, and one of the jokes I like to make when I'm like recruiting is it's silly that we have a revenue data science team because at most companies you count in the revenue, and then you're done. You don't need to have a PhD in statistics to figure this out. But again, because like a lot of our revenue comes from partnerships, like we don't have as much information as we possibly want to. So there's 3 big areas that this team plays in. One is revenue forecasting. So we work really closely with like our partners in finance to like try to like forecast the revenue. So obviously this means we need access to revenue data. We also do a lot of the standard like product data science work around our monetizable surface areas. And so this would be like things like A/B testing or opportunity sizing, or even just like kind of defining metrics and trying to understand user behavior that is either monetized or monetizable. And then finally, this last like kind of bullet point is like sort of the thing I want to dig into like a little bit. So we work really closely with the finance and business operation side of the world. And like often there are analysts in this space. And there are 2 kind of big things that we work on with them. One is around methods, and the other is around data access. So given that this is like what revenue data science looks like, what does a revenue data scientist look like? Our data scientists tend to have advanced degrees, like PhDs or masters in STEM fields. They're really great at SQL. Our tech stack is BigQuery, so it's important. And then also like scripting languages, so like Python or R. Team's a little split on that. We also work really closely with finance and business analysts, and these folks are subject matter experts. They know a lot about like business. They like understand how market trends work and like like what it means and how they think it will affect our revenue in ways that somebody with say a PhD in astronomy might not know from their training. They have like pretty basic SQL skills, like enough to do like a select star or whatnot. They're very proficient in Excel. And you can do pretty straightforward domain relevant modeling in Excel, right? Oh, that got moved. There are more pictures down there. So in the happy path, like the data scientist helps with advanced methodology because their PhD in stats like means that they know all of these different techniques that you wouldn't necessarily expect the finance or business analyst to know. And then the analysts provide really valuable domain expertise to like understand like why like this is just business logic and you don't have to stats at it. But it assumes that you have some foundation that often doesn't exist around like an easy to access like data interface. However, I will say in the usual path, the scientist does really complicated data pulls for the business analyst to answer simple questions that in principle they should be able to answer themselves. And so it really, I think, speaks to the need of treating revenue data at Mozilla as revenue data as a product, right? Like there are stakeholders both on the data science side and then on the business analyst side that need to be able to access and engage with data in a much more compelling way than we're able to. So this is where the Revenue Data Access Initiative came in. We realized that there was a big problem and we needed something to like kind of bridge that gap. And how were we going to get around this? We were going to start with like a data governance framework. And so we have this framework where we have like a policy, and then we have some processes that underlie it, and then the technical infrastructure that supports these processes. And then we also get to the point where, why are we even doing this? Like, does it matter? Are we just doing this for like to do it? But like really what we needed was people needed a visualization layer. They needed to be able to like engage with the data in a way that was intuitive to them so that they could make better decisions. And so we'll step through all of these here. So what is policy? Policy for us meant a principles-first approach to understand who should get access to sensitive data. And so the way that we like thought about this is like we had different categories of data and why they were sensitive. So category 1, this like kind of first level, is like data that was like kind of sensitive, but like you probably couldn't get to the most sensitive quantities that we were trying to safeguard. Category 2 was like a little bit more risky, right? It's data that would allow someone with enough math skills and like other kinds of information to back calculate these sensitive quantities that we're trying to safeguard. And then category 3 was like the most highly sensitive, the most restricted data, but also the most interesting, right? It's the things that you could actually make decisions about. But again, you don't want everybody to know because we have these responsibilities to our partners to keep them like confidential. The next part of this is like, who should get access to this data? And so we decided on a role-based access paradigm. So we have 2 types, permanent, and that means you have a job where you have to access revenue data on the regular. So I'm a revenue data scientist, and I do the monthly revenue forecast. And so I need to be able to touch the revenue data, right? That would be a permanent type of access. On the other hand, we have project-based, and so that might be where you're working on a project that requires access to these data, but there is like an end date in mind for that project. And so that could be, I'm a data engineer who's working on a data connector framework that like is going to touch a bunch of different data sources, including revenue data, because we want to standardize our ETL. But like, so I need to be able to look at the revenue data to like verify that like this thing actually worked, that it's plumbed correctly. But like after that, I don't need to touch revenue data. And so it's nice because we have this like nice little matrix of like what kind of data do you want and how do you want to engage with it, right? But the thing that's like really important here is that it's not just like the thing that makes this not ignorable is that like we need to make sure that it has some teeth, right? So people with access to these data have to understand that they need to handle these data responsibly, that there is like a lot of different there's a lot of risk riding on having access to this data, and they need to like have some sort of way to say that they've acknowledged that they comply. And so all of this stuff is like kind of like a nice like framework or like high level, right? But it's like very philosophical. And so the next kind of like important thing is like this policy needs to be accessible by like mere mortals. And so how did we do that at Mozilla? So we have a request and evaluation flow, and it starts in everyone's favorite tool, Jira, right? And we use Jira as a paper trail, right? It's a thing that we can point to. And so when somebody wants access to revenue data, they fill out this template, and it's explaining like who they are, why they want access, what they're going to do with it, what type of access they want. We then take this to data access stewards, who are the ones that are in charge of making the decision. So given the information that the requester has given, either they will or won't get access. And then finally, once it's confirmed if somebody will get access, then we leverage Google Groups because, as I said before, we use BigQuery, and it's kind of nice because we can use like the Google ecosystem to like portion out access in ways that make sense. One of the things that like is maybe a little bit of a misnomer is like I mentioned that it's like you can get permanent access, but it's not really permanent because we do auditing, right? So let's say you're a product manager who's working on revenue for like a year, but then you're bored and you're ready to go work on something else, and you've like moved to a different part of the company. You don't need access to these data anymore. So we do quarterly audits to make sure that somebody should retain their access. And so in this case, we have their manager request an extension, and then we have an access steward approve. And as we all know, sometimes projects take a little longer than we think they will, right? So for folks with temporary access, if you need this for a project, you can again ask for an extension. And like I know I'm getting into like the nitty-gritty, but it's like I think the thing that people tend to like kind of like gloss over is like, oh, data governance is like really important, which like yes, but this is what it looks like, right? It's not glamorous. It's kind of like these like questions that you have to like ask over and over again. So, cool. So how do we kind of tie this back to like it really being a data product? So the technical infrastructure has requirements, and these requirements are driven by policy, and they have to support the process. And I think what's really important, like just in general, is that like this kind of like infrastructure needs to like just be part of your normal like data development process. Like governance can't be this thing that like happens in a checklist or like outside or like whatever, right? It's like if you have kids, like you have to like, the Jessica Seinfeld method of getting them to eat vegetables is to blend them into their food, right? And so this is like the Jessica Seinfeld method of, I think, getting people to like really like live like the ideals of your data governance. And so for us, what this meant from a technical standpoint is we had differential access implementation. So only give access to those who need it and restrict access from those who don't. And we're leveraging BigQuery's authorized views to give differential access, which has been really convenient for us. And then the other thing, too, is like I said, all these data were in all these different places, in emails and spreadsheets and PDFs, and like maybe probably some back of someone's napkin somewhere. And so we needed to figure out how to get all of the data into like a single place. And we wanted to do this for a number of different reasons. One was to make the access configuration like much easier and like tractable. And two, we needed to like we want to do more stuff with the data, not just like the revenue numbers, but we want to do like more like processing and like other kinds of manipulations on top of the data to make the data sets more robust and more interesting. And then finally, it's like, again, sometimes things fail. It's really nice if you can get SRE support. You can't get SRE support from like the finance guy's email, right? Cool. And so then finally, it's like we worked on the framework, we had this technical thing, but like what was the thing that we were doing? I think it's kind of funny that in the previous talk, we talked about Looker for revenue data. Mozilla has chosen Looker for our data visualization layer. And it's been, I think, really important for us to do this because Looker in some ways is like a lot easier for people who need to make decisions about revenue data, people who want to like look at metrics like an easy way, and then also people who like can get like their hands a little bit dirty with data and maybe they want to do some slices, but like asking a data scientist repeatedly, well, can you do this cut of data? Can you do that cut of data? Can you do this other thing, right? It ends up getting like, it's like tiring loop, right? And so it's been really nice because we've been able to leverage BigQuery and its connection into Looker to like provide these kinds of like dashboards that are interactive for our stakeholders, right? And so we're taking this kind of like stuff that lived in like emails and PDFs, and like we're able to like wrangle it in a way such that it's like it really is a data product, because at the end you end up with something like this. Although, disclaimer, this is just like a GIF from the Looker website because I cannot show you anything with revenue data in it. Cool. So back to this like hierarchy of needs, right? So where did we go in this project? Like how far have we gotten? So we're at the point now where I think we have analytics, we have metrics. We actually do have segments, which is kind of exciting because like it's something like we just hired somebody in February and she like gave this report about like I have these segments, and so like we're talking about how to put them in Looker so that like our partners in business development can like play with them, right? And so we're at the point where like all of a sudden these data are like much more usable and much more like functional, and it's something where like we can get deeper insights, and we're able to do more sophisticated analyses on top of the data too, because like they're in a way that's like tractable and it can touch the rest of the data warehouse, right? So it's been kind of like a really successful project in that way. We're obviously not done. There's still like a lot of like there are more data sets that like we want to import. We want to like empower even more, and a lot of this is kind of in the previous talk. We're talking about like the Lego guy, like what does he want? So we're talking to our Lego people to try to figure out like what they want and what is the best way for us to take these data and like manipulate them and represent them in a way that is like the most useful for them. So to kind of like close the loop, how does this tie back to data privacy? So like revenue data and like personal data like are different domains, right? But the thing that they have in common is the sensitivity, like the fact that you really need to be careful in how you handle and think about the data. Data that contain potentially sensitive or personal information is sensitive for different reasons, right? And so the framework that you have to create is like a policy based on user privacy, as opposed to the policy that we use for revenue data is a policy based on business risk. The technical infrastructure, though, doesn't really have to be that different, right? It's still this notion around differential access. Only people who should have access to the data, like, will have access to it. And again, in order to like actually leverage this data, like, we want to have it like in a data warehouse, in a place where it can be supported by SRE, in a place where like ETLs all go and live happily like ever after, right? And so like in that sense, like this was like a really nice case study for us even internally to like how can we do this and how do we scale this out when we're thinking of not just like analytics products, but also like other types of data products. And then the empowerment layer, again, for revenue data, it's insights. And then for like the more like potentially sensitive data, it is insights, but it's also, we now have the ability, like using like this kind of framework, you have the ability to like make user-facing data product, and ones that are not only like interesting because of like the technical like underpinnings and whatever, but also interesting because they're ones that like are very respectful of your users. So I guess that's it. I guess like my three big takeaways are having data is not a luxury, but rather a necessity. Data governance is data strategy, and incorporating data governance into like sort of the day-to-day of how your organization like does business or thinks about data, and making these processes accessible to like everyone are critical to actually get people to adopt these practices. And then my like secret bonus one is don't sleep on analytics.